You mentioned, in your opinion, as an analyst, I'm taking it, that Israel was caught off guard with October 7th. So
Yes.
okay, I find that interesting because there are those who also say, they took 6 hours to respond. There was information beforehand, and this kind of speculation of possibly kind of letting something. They knew something was going to happen, and people have been called anti-Semitic for even postulating this. But then I do believe, I'll try and put the references up on screen, there are some credible sources that there was some level of information at some point. What would you make of those two things?
Yeah, I don't think that's anti-Semitic, but it does strike
No,
me
agreed,
as an untenable conspiracy theory, if you will. A good analogy would be the October 1973 war. In October 1973, Israel had clear information in its possession that Egypt and Syria planned to initiate a joint offensive to recover the territories, the Syrian and Egyptian territories that Israel had occupied in 1967. He even had a double agent planted in the highest levels of the Egyptian leadership
there's a
who
famous
gave it.
documentary about him, right? Sorry to interrupt.
Yes, Ashraf Marwan, who gave them specific information about the incoming attack. The problem was that Israel was ideologically predisposed to reject the relevance of such information. So just because you or I, think of it, just because you or I know there's a risk of driving, 180 kilometers an hour down the highway, um, doesn't mean we're not going to do it, and it doesn't mean that if you then cause or are involved in a very severe car accident, that somehow you didn't know this was the case. So I mean, this is maybe a poor analogy, but the point I'm trying to make is there's a fundamental difference between having information in your possession and then being able to process it properly
Right.
and take the appropriate decisions. 1973 is a very good example where Israel, because of its hubris, because it was convinced that Arabs don't know how to fight wars, because it was persuaded that Egypt and Syria would never be able to launch, not only wouldn't be able to launch a surprise attack on Israel, but wouldn't dare to do so, that it neglected the information in its possession and decided not to act on it until it was too late. I think the attacks of October 7th are even more damning for Israel because
Right.
Hamas managed to conceal its intentions and its preparations to a significantly greater extent. We're not talking about two conventional armies massing on the borders of occupied territories controlled by Israel. We're talking about what is arguably the most intensely surveyed territory, which is also, has the size of a postage stamp. And despite this, Israel was unable to connect the dots. We later learned that part of this is complacency, part of this is an over reliance on technology rather than human information. And a significant part of it, it turns out, was because Israel had devoted its best intelligence resources not to the Gaza Strip, where it was convinced once again that Hamas had other priorities it wouldn't dare and so on, and therefore had devoted its best intelligence services not to the potential threat coming from the Gaza Strip, but what it viewed as the very real threat that existed in Lebanon, namely that of Hezbollah. It is true, that Israel, very late in the day, I think only hours before, received more concrete warnings. And,
I think
and
it was
these
early
were,
hours of that morning.
yes, and these were signals or images or whatever they were that were observed by kind of junior intelligence officers stationed around the Gaza Strip, and they sent them up the food chain. And then more senior officers decided that these were not serious indications of an imminent attack and decided to ignore them. That, to me, is not evidence that Israel knew what was happening. decided to allow it to happen so that it could later take advantage of what it of the attacks in its
It's
response. Of course,
hubris, as you say.
yes, it's hubris, complacency, and in this particular case, I think one should also add incompetence. I mean, Israel was convinced, that it actually reduced its deployments in the region of the Gaza Strip. People have said, well, that's because it was being ruled by an extremist government that decided to focus on the West Bank and settlement expansion and so on. That's only partially true. As I was mentioning earlier, Israel is a relatively small state, with a relatively small society. And it decided that technology could do the job of multiple soldiers and intelligence officers. And this over reliance on technological solutions was, I think, part of its failures on October 7th.